here? Or?
Here's the controversy, right? So, does Title IX demand that women be defended from having men come into their bathrooms? That is really the basis of all of it now. Like Nancy Mace in Congress saying, putting biological above women for the women's room, and saying, I don't want penises in my bathroom with me. And I'm like, I don't know if there would be penises or not, right? But it is kind of like, this is gender discrimination against me.
Yeah, no, I know. It's
my bathroom.
Look,
right?
look, the whole logic of it. Well, I mean, it has led. There's a reason why we're at this point.
Yeah,
it is falling apart.
It's falling apart, and they need to just chuck the 1965 Civil Rights Act.
So, welcome to the Cutrone Zone. It's that time of the month again. I always say that, and then I think of menstruation. But but that's not what I'm indicating. It is time for another session of the Cutrone Zone. With me today is the last Marxist, genius, head of the campaign for a socialist party. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Chris Cutrone. So, Chris, thanks for coming on again.
Hi.
Hey, so what we're going to do this time is a little different. I wanted to talk about art with you and fiction. You recently released one of your lectures at the Art Institute of Chicago online. It was about Lukács' theory of the novel. And as a novelist, as a former novelist almost, I got to start writing again. I was interested in it and what you had to say and trying to understand what Lukács thought about the novel. In order to try to return to fiction writing myself, I do want to do that, and also to justify it politically, I guess. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong direction for that, but a lot of people would accuse the Frankfurt School, philosophers like Adorno and Horkheimer, of being cultural Marxists, and Lukács, beginning with a theory of the novel, would seem to justify that designation. And I wanted to talk to you about how we can understand art and fiction writing and music and all of it without engaging in the culture war or reducing art to partisanship or politics as we understand it now.
So there is something that maybe we could return to in a future episode, but I also feel like we're doing like almost a yearly ritual now, because I think our last Cutrone Zone in 2023 was on painting.
Oh, right.
It was. So we're kind of keeping up the Christmas tradition here of like giving some cultural art content for the holidays.
Yeah.
Right. And but as far as Lukács is concerned, so there are kind of three works associated with the pre-Marxist early Lukács. Soul and Form, which is a collection of essays, and The Theory of the Novel are considered at the time quite influential. And then I think that they maybe got fame subsequently because of Lukács' reputation as a Marxist. But then there's the question of how History and Class Consciousness, his first collection of really Marxist writings, fits in with these earlier pre-Marxist works. The later Lukács lumped them together as his early romantic self that he had corrected. But I think that there's a difference to be observed between The Theory of the Novel and Soul and Form on the one hand, and History and Class Consciousness on the other hand. I think it's scurrilous on his own part towards himself, towards his own history, and misrepresentation to say, oh, well, it's all romantic. And then he accused the Frankfurt School of following his early self erroneously. And like fidelity to his earlier self, but that's an error, right? And that for him, they are equally influenced by the pre-Marxist and the early Marxist writings. So they're equally influenced by soul and form, theory of the novel, and history and class consciousness. And that would be Ernst Bloch and Walter Benjamin, and maybe to a certain extent, someone not in the Frankfurt School, not Marxist, Siegfried Kracauer, but then Adorno as Benjamin's student. Now, I'll say about, and that's true, right? So the pre-Marxist Lukács is influential for Benjamin and Adorno. However, they observe a difference between his pre-Marxist and Marxist self. And they take history and class consciousness to be truly Marxist in a way that his later work they don't consider to be Marxist. So why do they think that? Because they think that history and class consciousness is dialectical in a way that his later work is not.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, his earlier work, Soul and Form and Theory of the Novel, are kind of demanding a more dialectical approach. They're sort of setting him up to be able to become the Marxist he became. And you could characterize these works as neo-Kantian. You could also characterize them like Gillian Rose does so. And then she sort of says history and class consciousness, and then Benjamin and Adorno are neo-Kantian in this way. It's a kind of neo-Kantian Marxism, but also neo-Hegelian. So, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there are these phenomena, neo-Kantianism and neo-Hegelianism. And I usually classify Theory of the Novel as a neo-Hegelian. And what that means is following Hegel's understanding of the relationship between art and society, literature. And in this respect, Hegel called modern art, and then it's a question of how much it applies to modernism. He called it romantic.
Mm-hmm.
Modern art as modern art is romantic, meaning the art of Hegel's own time. And Lukács' Theory of the Novel is centered on the novel as it came into being and attained to its concept in the late 18th and early 19th century. So in this romantic moment, like Goethe, and then the realism of the early 19th century. That is the paradigmatic novel that starts in the Renaissance and goes up to that time. And then you have this other thing that happens at the end of the 19th century, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky.
Right.
Right. And that Dostoevsky, that Tolstoy is the sort of outer limit of the novel form, and then Dostoevsky is already beyond the novel. That's the idea.
I've read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I've read Notes from the Underground, or Notes from Underground. And that's my full understanding of those two authors. And I sometimes get them mixed up with each other. Which one's Dostoevsky and which one's Tolstoy? But my memory is that Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich is very much what I would consider to be a plotted story. It has where Notes from the Underground, it was more about the kind of the rantings of the character and the philosophical explorations of the character, and I don't even recall a story or a plot.
Exactly.
In Notes from the Underground.
That's right.
So the step beyond the novel is a step beyond narrative altogether in a way.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. So let's think about, I'm going to make reference also in our discussion to something that is a little bit off topic, and that's Benjamin has a piece called The Author as Producer. And it goes to the issue of politics and art, political tendency versus literary quality.
Right.
And also then there's a third category, literary tendency. And so political tendency and literary tendency have to do with progress. Is it progressive in its tendency? Literary quality is more, he says, the writer who doesn't teach other writers teaches no one.
Right.
So it's about that older idea of the bourgeois education that is built into art and literature and music. Visual art, literature, music, all the arts are meant to be instructive. They're supposed to contribute to our enlightenment about our aesthetic subjectivity, our aesthetic experience, and they are supposed to be therefore educational, aesthetically educational, at the level of form. Now, the criteria for the novel, according to Lukács in the theory of the novel, so there's epic literature, which is an ancient thing. It goes back to the hunter-gatherers, basically storytelling. And so that is narrative art per se. And then the idea is that the novel is both a continuity and a change from the epic form. So it is a transformation of the narrative art form as such. And therefore, the question is, in what way does it change it? And in some respects, it secularizes the epic, if we can talk about it that way. So one criterion of the novel as opposed to the epic is, he says, time is a character in the novel in a way that time itself is not a character in the epic.
Okay.
So
can I ask a question about that? So in the novel, does that mean the historical moment that the characters are in becomes a character, and the changes that occur through history become as a kind of character?
Subsidiarily, it does. In other words, consequentially, it does. But no, he's talking about like you're reading and you're aware of time. You're aware of the time of the story, what's happening, the time of events. But you're also aware of the time of the mental process of the characters, right? So a kind of psychological realism. But you're also aware of the time of the narration itself, right? So you're aware of the author's time in the writing as he's telling the story. You're aware of the character's time, and you're aware of the time of events.
Okay, so one of the things that when I was first starting to write fiction that I played around with and kind of had to work with was tense. And how I would order the story, and I liked to play this trick where if something was taking place in the past, I would have it I would relate it in the present tense, and if something was happening to the character directly or to the narrator, something was happening to the narrator directly, I would make it in the past tense. And I felt like it served a function that a memory might be more immediate than what's happening to you now.
Yeah.
So this was a way of playing with time. Also, telling the story out of sequence was also a way to play with time. So you would start at the end and then go back.
Absolutely.
Kind of thing.
Right. So time and psychology are closely tied here. And it's not a Freudian conception of psychology whatsoever, right? It's much more subjective experience in the sense of what we usually mean by the subjective, right? So we have the subjectivity of the author, we have the subjectivity of the characters, and then we have this more generalized subjectivity of society that is a function of the temporality of events. And also what's assumed to be an event by all concerned, by the author, by the characters, right? So it's very much, bound up in the plot and the story and, the assumptions there. Now, again, having that be deliberately thematized means that it can be played with. And that has been the case since the dawn of the novel, according to Lukács, which he dates back to the Renaissance, basically Dante. And then Cervantes, and then really achieves a kind of full flowering with Goethe, and specifically the apprenticeship of Wilhelm Meister. Right. So what's bound up in this temporality, that criterion, is becoming. Meaning the Bildungsroman, the novel that tells you how the protagonist, and also therefore, in a sense, it's implied how the author came to be the person that they are. Right. So that's what determines the beginning, the middle, and the end. And it also determines what the process of the story is about, like the substance of it. In a way that the epic, you kind of know who everyone is right away, and you might also know what is going to happen to them because there might be some tragic fate waiting for them. You know, so again, it's a different, you know, when we read ancient scripture and texts, because really it's narration as the oral tradition as scripture, right? So that's really bound up in it, meaning when you pick up, I don't know, the Old Testament or the New Testament, is it like picking up a novel? Because it is. But then what kind of novel is it? And it's obviously an epic, right? Maybe the Gospels, maybe the New Testament is more like a bourgeois novel. Or at least it seems to be that way after the Protestant Reformation, right? People relate to the character of Jesus. They relate to the stories told by his apostles. They relate to Jesus's own parables, perhaps differently than they did in medieval Christianity. So again, in an epic, you know, basically the ultimate narrator is God. Whereas in the novel, it's a human being.
Right.
And yet, the voice of the novel is still the voice of scripture, is still the voice of God, but in a transformed way. Except we know that it's not God, we know it's a person.
Right.
Right? So that's, you know, because these are ancient forms. You know, language is ancient. Storytelling is ancient, you know?
That was the other thing I had to work on, was deciding on the voice for a piece. I wanted to tell a particular story. Whose story was it going to be? And when I decided whose story it was going to be, that would help me make other decisions that seem technical, like first person or third.
Yeah.
You know, and so.
But
and I felt
cosmic. It's not just technical. Like, it is technical, but it's also cosmic. Meaning, the self-evident character of ancient narration seemed to have come from a cosmic source. Whereas we make decisions. Right. We don't feel like we're voicing God.
Right.
And yet we do. We still do. You know, I was suddenly thinking about like film in this way. You know, that it's like the God's eye view.
Right.
And yet it can also be very much a person's view. But we're sort of aware in film when it shifts from more like a God's eye view to more of like a person's view, when the camera is doing something different.
Well,
right?
I mean, one way to do that is obviously to move the camera to be at the eye line of a character, and then go back and forth between cameras as if they're two characters looking at each other. But as I'm making this documentary, one of the things, because I'm narrating it, one of the things I'm hoping is getting across is that all of the documentary is my point of view. None of it is in any objective point of view.
Oh yeah, also because you're editing it.
Yeah, I'm editing it. I'm narrating it. I'm building it. I'm structuring it. I'm writing it basically, and so yeah, and so yeah, finding a voice for even this documentary film is part of the
intelligibility of the art form, right? What does it have to assume about any viewer, any reader? Right. And that's where society comes in. Right. In the ancient art of storytelling, it's a story told by the tribe to itself about itself. Right. And of course, that's God. You know, to get like, I don't know, Durkheimian society of God. right? And we've secularized it. And we've made people agents of it in a different way, because we're not just like vehicles of divine forces. You know, we're not just playthings of the gods. The idea is that we do things that are consequential, including, you know, we make decisions that impact what we become. Right? And that's really the story of the novel. Right? Again, how the character becomes who they are, and by their own doing. And that the reader is invited in to share that process.
Right. And the thing is, all of us today have only really experienced, when it comes to reading, novels, right?
And even if that's why I brought up film, because I think, okay, we kind of get our storytelling now through film more than through literature. I feel like literature has now become strange to people. You know, in other words, they treat it like the formal technical stuff just seems like artifice. It's hard for people to place the substance of it, the stakes, you know, those kinds of decisions you were talking about.
Right. When did that change, do you think? Do you think that was before we were born that it kind of happened?
Yeah, it would have had to have happened before we were born. I mean, there's a question of mass literacy. And, you know, like, obviously, part and parcel of the bourgeois novel form is mass literacy of a kind. Mass in comparison to any community that came before. And it is bound up with mass literacy of the Bible.
Right.
Right? And, you know, because that's the reason why you wanted mass literacy, really, is that everybody could read the Bible. It's very bound up with Protestantism and putting the Bible into people's hands. And I think that basically there was this moment when maybe everyone could have been a reader of novels, but just at that very moment, film came in. Late 19th, early 20th century, you know, like just at the moment when maybe literally everyone is a reader of novels, then film comes in. Now, film, of course, does something entirely different from literature, I think, aesthetically. I think so. But what they have in common is storytelling. And they also have in common, although differently, the thematization of time. Right? And this kind of play with time. And I think that that's where, you know, basically the other thing that's interesting about the way Lukács talks about it, and why he ends up rejecting his own thesis, I think, when he becomes more of like a socialist realist type, is, you know, he does very explicitly talk in a romantic way, meaning that the novel might be the end of art. It might be the beginning of art. It might be the end of art. You know, because he has this very romantic kind of opening where he says, you know, unproblematic societies don't need philosophy. And they only need art as like the kind of affirmation of being at home in the world. You know? And then you get problematic art forms, and with them, philosophy, only when society becomes problematic. So he defines the novel as a problematic art form, meaning in comparison to the ancient epic, which is like a kind of perfected art form, the novel is about problematizing that art form, or rendering that art form problematical. And it's about problematical individuals in a problematical society expressing themselves through problematic art. So what he says is that the novel is half art, half not art. So it is like the ancient epic, but then it's not. And the half that is not art is, he calls, journalism. Meaning that it becomes very much a document of its own time, in a way that the ancient epic is that, but is not meant to be that. It's sort of that by accident, whereas the novel is by intention.
On the word problematic,
I know.
we should pause.
Right.
Because, you know, about a decade ago, I think it was the first time I encountered the phrase, your celebrity hero is problematic. I don't even think that's what they said, but something like that. Um, but your fave is problematic is what it said.
Oh, really?
Yeah, your fave is problematic. So like if you like Taylor Swift, she's problematic, which means racist, sexist,
Yeah. No, so we don't
homophobic.
mean it like that. But
Yeah.
we also
What does it mean? Problematic.
Okay, so I was
Exactly.
going to say when you started problematizing problematic, I was reminded of Kevin Anderson of the
Mhm.
Marxist humanists, who
Mhm.
on I think it might have been the very first panel that Platypus ever did on imperialism, he
Mhm.
used the word problematic and then immediately apologized for it as a Nietzschean word. And I was like, is that a Nietzschean word? Maybe it is. In other words, maybe
I
that's
thought it was Kantian. Doesn't
right, exactly, right. But really, I think it might be a postmodernist word,
Oh,
in which case it's simultaneously Nietzschean and Kantian.
okay. Okay.
Right? But it's neither of those things in Lukács. However, there are some uncanny parallels between this early Lukács and Nietzsche,
Okay.
right? Because Nietzsche similarly says that when you have philosophy, you kind of no longer have art, right?
Mhm.
Or art changes, or tragedy becomes comedy. And so that would be a parallel between the epic and the novel. And that's why you can say that the novel is bourgeois in the sense of the Renaissance, but there are antecedents for it in antiquity.
Mhm.
But that antecedent would parallel the shift from tragedy to comedy, meaning narrative that's about existential cosmic reality and the divine and the will of the gods, to a form like a dramatic form or a narrative form that's about society and people and their choices and the consequences of their actions,
Mhm.
right? That comedy meaning not haha comedy, but comedy meaning a human story rather than a story about the gods,
Mhm.
right? And that, of course, that's the difference between epic and novel as well,
Mhm.
right? And so to be problematical means to problematize. So what is being problematized is the community itself, meaning the community is no longer has an unproblematic relationship to its place in the universe, its cosmic meaning, its relation to its gods, and therefore it no longer has an unproblematical relationship to itself. And that the novel is an expression of that, of the community becoming problematical to itself and the individual. So that's another parallel with Nietzsche, is that this marks the emergence of the individual, so that characters have a fundamentally different quality in the novel than they do in the epic. In the epic, characters are just ciphers,
Mhm.
whereas in the novel, they're subjects.
Well, I want to hold up this book, Ubik, by Philip K. Dick. It could have been a variety of other novels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big
Yeah,
fan of
yeah.
Philip K. Dick,
Mm-hmm.
and because when you're talking about problematizing society, the way it gets problematized in Philip K. Dick novels like Ubik
Mm-hmm.
is epistemologically,
Right. Yeah.
as in like what can I know about the world outside of myself, and by extension, what can I know about myself,
Mm-hmm.
given how uncertain the world has become, given the way the ground has dropped away beneath my feet. He was a man who was plagued by two questions, according to biographers, and I think he said it himself: what is real,
Mm-hmm.
and what is human?
Mm-hmm.
What is it to be human, and what is reality?
Mm-hmm.
And so his books are all about how problematic the world has become in
Mm-hmm.
1950s,
Mm-hmm.
60s, 70s America. And it gets expressed in these sci-fi ways where, gee whiz, the world, you thought you were talking to your wife, but she's a robot.
Mm-hmm.
Or you thought you were out in the country, but really it's a simulation and you're inside of a gigantic bunker run by the
There's something
commies.
frankly subjective about bourgeois art
Right.
in a way that's not the case with pre-bourgeois art. So the epic is not frankly subjective the way the novel inevitably is, meaning it's about the subject, right? And so why did narrative art have to become about the subject? Why did painting have to become about the subject? Because it happens at around the same time. And he also has lyric poetry for him, because there was epic poetry before there was lyric poetry. And lyric poetry is defined by the singular voice, the solo singer, the lyricist. And the distinction he makes there is that the novel has time as a character. The lyric poem doesn't really have time as a character because it's subjective in another way. It's not about the person moving through the world. It's really about the person experiencing their own experience. And so therefore it's about lifting the lyrical moment outside of time. It's transcending time in a way that the novel remains embedded in time. And that also has to do with the way one reads. In other words, the experience of time in reading is different in the novel or in fiction than in the lyric poetry. Right. So, again, and painting, I think we've talked about this, how the easel painting takes primacy. So there used to be history painting, but that's become a kind of an odd genre that we're aware of when we see like a mural, right? Whereas the easel painting is really about the individual viewer and is about like the subjective perspective of the painter, like very explicitly. And, the genres associated with that, like portraiture and still life and landscape. Right. Again, frankly subjective in a way that it wouldn't necessarily have occurred to the community to have that art form. And yet that has become the dominant art form.
Right.
That the art appeals to the individual as such. Now, I say all this only because why did Lukács denounce his own work?
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask you about, you tell me, and then I'll see if my question is relevant. You go ahead.
Well, that it becomes a little uncomfortable, meaning if it's about the individual as such, then what about society? Can it only be the individual against society? Can it only be this bourgeois liberal standpoint? Can it therefore only be an apologia for capitalism? Right? And so the socialist realist demand is that, that the individual's story be in some way more immediately the story of the collective. And, so you mentioned Tolstoy. Tolstoy's not a Marxist, but he is a socialist.
Right.
He's a Christian socialist.
Yeah.
He's a romantic socialist. He's a reactionary socialist. He's a feudal socialist. We have these terms from Marx. But he is a socialist in a way that Dostoevsky is not. Right? And so did the 20th century belong to Tolstoy or to Dostoevsky? Maybe Dostoevsky won, and maybe that's unfortunate. From a socialist realist perspective. Shouldn't have all novelists been following Tolstoy rather than Dostoevsky?
Well, I mean, when you say that the novel is the epic but problematized and turned towards the individual and the subject, I mean, it's easy to think that one or two things. One, that we ought to suppress the novel because it's liberal,
too individualistic,
capitalist nonsense, which I wouldn't go with. But then the other thing that might be a little bit more acceptable to think is, well, after we sublate capitalism into socialism, we won't have novels anymore. We will no longer be problematized. We will have something more like the epic
Yeah,
form. Our art will simply confirm us in the world, which, by the way, makes me a little uncomfortable as well. Like
it should. It
you
should.
know,
It
yeah,
absolutely should.
yeah,
Right. So exactly, meaning it's a false choice. It's an antinomy. It's an antinomy of capitalism. Meaning, of course, the novel is our collective art form.
Mhm.
Meaning, our individuality is collective in nature. Right. It's
Right,
not like, oh, you have to acknowledge that aren't just yourself. You're a product of the collective. Yeah. And guess what? I'm an individual as a product of the collective. The collective has individuated itself in me.
hmm
And this is language that um, Lukács uses,
hmm
right? That the novel form is about that individuation. Again, how did the protagonists become themselves in a way that they weren't before? When does John Q. Public become the hero of a novel?
right.
Right?
And in Tolstoy apparently maybe or
Wait,
before
but
that.
it's usually in Tolstoy. It's some like weird selfless thing, you know. It's some kind of like renouncing your privilege or something,
Oh yeah,
right? And it's
yeah.
like,
And the death of Ivan Ilyich. It's like
yeah, total
certainly, yeah,
Christian, like
yeah.
whatever, right? Sorry,
Mhm.
claptrap. I mean, no, I mean,
That's a great. No, it's a
Tolstoy
great
is great.
story. Yeah,
Tolstoy is great, but if you turn it into a political imperative, then it's just kitsch,
right. Yeah.
right? I
hmm
mean, in other words, we should save Tolstoy from Tolstoyanism,
hmm
right? But in the 1930s, the Soviet Union had to say that they achieved socialism for
Right.
political reasons, for ideological reasons. And therefore, they had to adopt socialist realism. They had to put an end to the modernist experimentation and denounce it as individualistic, formalistic, solipsistic, antisocial.
You know, the charge of being formalistic and being individualistic always struck me as being contrary charges, like
They
in
are.
contra,
They are.
right?
So you know how it works, though, Doug? It's something like this. And I'm reminded of, Brecht.
hmm
So I was just teaching this in my Benjamin course at SAIC. And, that Brecht said that he had a dream. He told Benjamin that he had a dream in which he was brought up before a party tribunal. And they said, are you really serious? You say you're a communist, you say you're a Marxist, but are you really serious? And he's like, I have to admit, actually, I'm not. I care more about art.
hmm
Right?
Right. Right.
And basically in telling this dream to Benjamin, he was talking about his sort of, feeling of dread, but then he said that should be permissible, that the artist
Right.
should care more about art. And
Yeah.
that actually that's how you serve the community,
Yeah.
is to be true to your work as an artist. Right? And that's again the Benjamin quote that I cited earlier about the writer who doesn't teach other writers. The writer who doesn't teach people to become writers teaches no one.
Right.
Meaning it's got to be formalistic in that sense. Meaning it's got to provide a formal education in the form, in writing. Right?
Yeah.
It's got to
Yeah.
make you a better reader, as it's got to educate you as a reader in such a way that might turn you into a writer.
Yes. And okay, so here's the problem there. Okay, is that I'm just speaking as someone who, my first novel, I'm going to hold it up because I'm promoting myself. Billy Moon. It was published by Tor, which is
Yeah,
Macmillan.
Tor. Yeah, I have many
Commercial.
Tor.
Yeah, yeah. A commercial press.
Science fiction.
Science fiction. I wrote short stories for magazines for years before I got a novel published, and there is a commerce side to writing
Yeah.
that seems to run against this writing for formal reasons of innovation or even individual
But does it?
expression.
In other words, what kind of a commodity is the artwork? So if the artwork liberates itself by becoming a commodity, meaning it leaves its ritual function behind. It no longer is justified by that social ritual function immediately, but is rather mediated through its commodity character. Then what kind of a commodity is it? In other words, does the customer, does the buyer, does the reader demand a certain quality? What's the use value of this commodity?
Well, what I have found as a writer is that my work has been more praised by critics and other writers than by general readers of science fiction. I don't always.
That's a marked distinction.
I guess so,
To be
but
productive. Yeah.
but it's better. It's more commercially rewarding to be the other way around. And
Well, sure.
yeah, and just for obvious reasons. I mean, just and the fact is, my work doesn't always meet genre expectations. I'm not always aiming to do things with the genre that people generally do. I'm not
Meeting
telling
expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not telling an adventure story most of the time. I'm usually setting it in. I don't think I've ever written about a character who was not just an everyday kind of person, but was like in a position of authority that could give them the ability to become heroic, like a soldier or even a detective or somebody like that. I haven't done that. So there are a number of ways in which I don't meet genre expectations. And I would say that those who do meet genre expectations generally do so. Although there in the 90s and early 2000s, there was.
Aren't there everyman heroes in science fiction?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, in Philip K. Dick, there are. Yeah. For sure. But it comes and goes. But there are always everyman heroes. But there's also the commercial blockbusters after Star Wars, say,
you want like a prophetic main character who's changing the whole universe.
Right. I mean, it's really hard to say what it is going to be really to mold, but generally third person.
What Lukács calls entertainment literature. He calls it the novel of abstract idealism.
Yeah, so I want to understand how because I want to be entertaining when I write, but how does the entertainment novel come up as opposed to this instructive novel?
Because I mean, it's a distinction that Adorno makes between light and serious music. Meaning there is music to be listened to in a light way, and there's music to be listened to in a serious way. And similarly with literature, there's light literature and there's serious literature.
Right.
Right. And now they're not wholly distinct, but there is some difference. And there is maybe, I don't know, a spectrum. And also you can do things with lightness that you can't do with seriousness, as well as you can do things with seriousness that you can't do with lightness.
Right.
Right. And I think that the basic point is, yes, there are objects of aesthetic consumption that one does not want to put a lot of work into consuming, we might say. This is why kitsch is associated with the pre-digested, meaning it's pre-digested so that you don't have to do that much work digesting it. Like, it's very straightforward. It's like the mother bird who digests the food for the chicklets, right? And sometimes we all want that sometimes, but sometimes we want something else, right? Sometimes we want something more engrossing, more challenging, more difficult, taking more effort. Sometimes we get more satisfaction out of that than the light bear.
Well, someone like Philip K. Dick is a light writer, right? He's a genre writer, so by definition, he's sort of light. But to really understand his books, you have to pay attention, and they become complicated, even if they're not complicated usually
on the surface.
On the level of style.
There are different, there are different layers, right? There are different levels at which this can take place.
Right.
In other words, I think that it can happen at the gestalt level of the work. It can happen at the prose level of the work. I mean, there are different tastes and forms and things, like, meaning when we talk about like the novel form in this general way, there's a myriad diversity of styles nonetheless, within that general category. And so, I mean, I think that one challenge for us is how everything is part of the same story, as opposed to each story. Right, so that would be another desideratum or criterion of the novel form, is that it is a self-enclosed whole. Right, that it isn't just, okay, I'm reading this novel or that novel, but it's just part of the general stream of novels. And it's just one more episode of the TV show.
Right.
Which is fine. On the other hand, maybe each episode should aim to be its own thing. Right? You can tell when a TV episode is directed by someone.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, you watch your favorite TV shows, some stand out as like, oh, this was really directed. So that's part of what we're talking about. And I mean, the charge of formalism, to get back to it, was just like a cheap shot. It was just like, oh yeah, these artists, they're putting their own craft ahead of their social duty. In other words, it was an easy charge to level at people in a very opportunistic way.
Right.
Especially leveled against real craftsmen by hacks.
Right.
Yeah. And that's really what it was about in the Soviet Union. There were these hacks who became bureaucrats and were like, I wish I could write like Doug Lain, but I can't. So I'm going to accuse them of formalism.
Right. Right. Well, I love that fantasy, but I think that
and he's such an individualist because he just cares about his craft.
Right. Yeah. Right. But those things, to focus on, I would think, if you're being rigorous and consistent, if you are trying to develop an artwork that is confirming and fits into society, you would be concerned about the formal aspects of it and how,
I think we have difficulty with this, right? Because I think that for the most part, we live in a culture where there is a great deal of connoisseurship and technical criticism. In other words, your average reader of novels, will say this was well written, this was poorly written, but they mean just a pure like performance engineering criteria. Like it's just like there were no kinks.
Yeah, this went down. This went down smoothly.
Yeah,
I did not have to stop and reread the sentence to get a meaning out.
Right. People will say a film is well made or well directed, and what they mean is that it just confirms their expectations, and that's not good enough. Meaning,
right?
Obviously, this is again another Lukács criterion of the novel, which is about freedom. It's about the autonomy, the self-determination of the protagonist, and vicariously, therefore, for the author, and also for the reader. In other words, that the experience of reading the novel can give the reader a sense of their own autonomy, as presented by the autonomy of the writer, and thematized through the autonomy of the character. Right? That the fact that the narrative voice can do something unexpected. Right?
Right.
And so if we're to reject that as like, nah, that's not what I was looking for, you're rejecting your own freedom.
Yeah. But would go back to my own formation here. When I was starting out, there were two books that I would return to that were how-to books on how to be a writer. One of them was called On Becoming a Novelist by John Gardner.
Mhm.
and the other one was called Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldman. Becoming a writer, important for you to, I lost you there for a second.
Mhm.
Why is it important for you to read a lot of other novels? Why is it important for you to try out a lot of different styles?
Mhm.
How literate do you have to become to be a novelist of any worth? And Gardner said, you have to become extremely literate. You have to read
Mm.
widely. You have to read the classics. You have to understand all the different kinds of techniques that are available to you and how
Yeah.
to use them. You have to be extremely literate. You have to be extremely well read. You have to write in a variety of ways. You should avoid kitsch work as a reader and certainly as a writer. And then ultimately, the aim of being a truly great novelist is to create tales, stories, novels, books that are morally instructive.
Huh, really?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and just exactly what that meant. He argued fairly in a fairly complicated way. But and this was a long while ago when I last read the book. But that was Gardner, and then the other one, Natalie Goldman, it was Writing Down the Bones. It was all about Zen Buddhism and getting in connection with your inner self and getting out of your own way and getting into a state of an egoless state and having a regular practice of writing. Both of those books, gave good advice.
Yeah, they're both good advice in their own way.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But they neither one were solving the problem of like what is a novel really,
Mm.
and why are you engaged in
Right.
this activity?
Right.
Which maybe I didn't even need to know at that point.
Yeah, you don't. I mean, that's the thing, right? So it's not like, I mean, look, I teach at a social justice lefty school.
Mm-hmm.
I teach artists.
Right.
And I think that they do agonize the students over, like, why they should be artists and, what's the ultimate social justification for their work. And again, starting with, you have a duty to the art form you're engaged in
Mm-hmm.
is not the worst place to start. And it is a social thing.
Right.
I mean, it's division of labor.
Mm-hmm.
Society needs people to be good at what they're good at, or their profession, what they're trying to do. And then you do have to figure out whether you're good at it and whether you should do it, whether you're good enough at it, whether you're interested enough in it, really do it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're performing a useful social duty in your professional status in the division of labor.
Right.
I mean, this is a question that should be asked. And it's not like there's one answer. There are a variety of ways that one can serve,
Mm-hmm.
in any genre, in any medium.
Right.
But, one should be responsible to, I mean, again, this is a bourgeois criterion. It is, that you should aim, it's a very, like, kind of Protestant, find your calling and try to excel in it.
Right.
And you can never be sure whether the calling that you feel is actually what God was truly calling you to do. And so,
Right.
like, pursuing your calling is a never-ending thing. Like, in other words, you thought that you were supposed to be, a capitalist entrepreneur, but it turns out actually you are called to serve the homeless at a soup kitchen.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, that can happen. Yeah. Or you thought you were meant to be a novelist, but it turns out you were actually meant to be a YouTuber.
No, though it's sad about the internets
Mm-hmm.
is that it's just fallen into a very generic, boring form. Like, remember when the internet started out and it's like, we could do all sorts of crazy shit with this. And it's like, and then we just don't.
Yeah.
Right? It's supposed to be interactive and, it's supposed to be like genre busting and, scramble up everything, be a whole new, talk about epistemology. Wasn't
Right.
supposed to be totally new epistemologically. As it turns out, it's like Adorno says, it's just another mass medium of distribution of basically a very well-established bourgeois form.
Right. Well, yeah, like the talk show, like
Yeah.
what we're doing now, right? I mean, Dick Cavett, basically. But what in the realm of publishing and literary writing, even genre writing that was aiming to be literary, when the internet really came into its own in the late 90s and early 2000s, the idea was, oh, you're going to write in a
Literature will
non-linear
be different. Yeah.
non-linear way, and
Yes.
you're going to have people write
Hypertext.
hypertext experimental stories.
I tried some of that.
Did you? You
Yes,
wrote
I
some
did.
of that?
Of course.
Yeah, yeah. And how did that go for you? Where did it get published, and what?
I
was your
didn't.
experience?
That was not published. So my publishing as a writer
Mhm.
was poetry.
Mm.
And I think that I was too in love with poetry to really try to be a hypertext writer. I don't know. It's like there are different ways of coming at the hypertext question. One
Mhm.
was fiction, the other was poetry.
Right.
And I did feel like poetry is already hypertext.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
maybe there's more possibility for play hypertextually with fiction. And we
Yeah.
grew up, by the way, with some like proto-hypertextual fiction, like choose
Your own adventure
Yeah.
stories. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
which
yeah.
I loved. I loved that.
Yeah, those are great.
They were charming. And and other variations on such. Parallel text. We've talked about Samuel Delany.
Hmm.
And that kind of thing. And so I didn't. I felt like it actually drove me more into video art. When I tried to contemplate hypertext with poetry, it made me move more in the direction of image and text. And moving image, as opposed to photo book text, which is also a thing and good, but again, well-established genres. That have their origins in the avant-garde in the early 20th century.
Right. Who were what video artists or filmmakers were most influential on you? When you
I was exposed to what everyone was exposed to probably in that world, like the Stan Brakhage, Maya Deren type stuff. But then there's Peter Kubelka, like experimental film, Michael Snow. I feel like you and I have very similar education in that domain. Like, you and I know these things, and maybe young people don't know them as well.
Right. Well, I don't remember Michael Snow. I should look up Michael Snow.
Michael Snow's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of, very, non-narrative film would be the genre. Non-narrative film that's poetic.
Right.
Right. That's lyrical in that way. It's like a kind of lyricism of images.
Yeah, and I think that because I'm a storyteller, write fiction, that even in the visual arts, I tend to be like, I like conceptual art because there's this idea in it that it's not just an aesthetic experience. It's not, but that I can see the individual thinker behind it, and so I tend to go in that direction. Like I like the Surrealists. The Surrealists were practically painting fantasy and science fiction paintings, when they, in a sense. So,
so the thought process.
Yeah, yeah, and not so much the sensuous side. I'm more cerebral, even though I'm not that. I'm not saying I'm so smart, but it's just like something about it, the words and the ideas, not the philosophy. I went into philosophy when I left. I did not get a creative writing degree. I started out in creative writing at Eckerd College and left, and then moved to Portland and got a philosophy degree instead, and stopped taking literature classes and stopped taking creative writing classes. and went with
I also
philosophy
feel like we
instead.
lived through the time when, I don't know, that kind of thing might have been in the process of being liquidated in favor of like social group identity stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, right after us, I think. Really.
Right. I
And
mean,
probably
in our time too. In our time, it was already kind of cropping up. I mean, it's not that
well,
it was
you went to grad school later on. You didn't go to
Right.
grad school right away, so you definitely probably experienced it in grad school. And I saw like in the 90s because I stayed in as an undergrad for a while. I drop out, go back, and drop out, and go back. So like by the mid 90s when I finally graduated, it was beginning. It was beginning. Or ramping up again. The neoliberal people on campus were talking about it, the neoliberal university. And what can we do to stop it?
Yes.
So yeah.
Right. So I do think that I was always, and I think that this is generally true. So when I was active as an artist, I did meet artists who were pegged into that role of, being sort of representatives of their social group. Their work was pegged to a kind of identity status, like Glenn Lagan, painter, and others. I actually met a lot of the new black, post-black artists. Like 90s, early 90s. That was a moment of that. And uniformly they said that they felt like critics were paying attention to the wrong aspects of their work, that they were reducing their identity. In other words, it was self-evident to them that they would never have become artists if they weren't in love with the form.
Right. Of course.
Right? And yet non-artists don't know that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet, of course, non-artists should be invited into knowing that. Right?
Right.
That the art should provide an entry into that. It's not like you have to become an artist, but make you aware of it.
Right. Right. Well, I feel like the arts have been under attack for the last decade or so in a way that is sort of surprising.
In a very barbaric way, actually.
Yeah. Like that, just like I recall going to an art museum in Colorado a few years ago, probably half a decade or so ago, and the descriptions of the work were all these treatises on the identity politics embodied in the work and the kind of mainstream progressive politics that these works are said to represent, and I was like, but it's like neon green. Why isn't that mentioned? It's like neon green, or it looks like a cartoon. Why are all the
people have lost the ability to talk about these things? I think there's been a diminution of consciousness around them. I went on one of my European vacations the summer before the pandemic, so 2019. Went to Florence, Rome, and Paris. Not in that order. It was Paris first, and then Florence, and then Rome. And in Paris, we went to the Musée d'Orsay, which is the modern art museum. And I did my obligatory pilgrimage to see the artworks that I always teach in the flesh, and it was amazing. And but I was hunting high and low for paintings that I knew had to be on the wall, and they weren't. And one of them was Manet's Olympia. It was not in its usual spot. It was in a special exhibit on the representation of Black people in French art.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I was like, that's just wrong. Because of the Black woman in the painting. I was just like, what is going on here? Do you know? I was just like, this.
And by the way, how much is there to say?
Right, there's not much to say. There really isn't, except now there is, right? In other words, like in the 19th century, yes, the Black woman represents modernity. In other words, represents this new cosmopolitan world. She's not like a freed slave or something. She's not. She's a woman from Africa or the Caribbean. In other words, she's there because of global trade and because Blacks have always been in Europe. I mean, really throughout, but you know, especially in the bourgeois era. And there isn't that much to say about it. But somehow it was like, okay, we need to justify still exhibiting this painting. So here's a way that we can kind of freshen it up in terms of its topical relevance by including it in this group show. And it was it just struck me as like, okay, this is just what you'd expect from the art world.
Mm-hmm.
That they're not sure why these paintings are important anymore. Oh, but wait, it's a document of how Black people were represented by French painters. And it's like, yeah, I guess so. You know, yeah. I mean, and it's like, this is, you know, because again, otherwise it's unclear why we should care about this canonical work.
Right. Well, let's just take a look at it again right now. Here it is.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Doug, you're terrible. You are a situationist to the end.
So yeah. Try that again. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
children, that's not really the painting. No, I mean, you know, our viewers don't know that. Reversal of roles.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I found that. Well, I looked it up, and that was one of the choices, and so I thought, oh, that's what I'll show.
It's interesting that they put the Black woman in clothes, though.
Oh yes, that is interesting.
Yeah,
yeah, and well, yeah, the white woman remains nude.
Remains nude, but covered.
Yeah, covered by the flowers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take a second. I'll put the
cat remains the same, though.
The cat
remains the same.
That should be the title of this episode. Mm-hmm. But no. So yeah, here it is, the actual painting, or not the painting, but a digital representation.
Reproduction.
Mm-hmm. But so yeah, when you have the connection between the visual arts and fine arts and popular novels and the way we approach art overall might not be so apparent, you know. But if you read Lukács' theory of the novel, the distinctions between the visual arts and poetry and music and prose
narrative
kind of fall away a bit, because there's something more generally happening in society that's shaping how all of these different art forms are received and created and produced. So, I guess. What I want to say is that in order to avoid the culture war that has reduced these paintings, it does seem like you do have to take a stance to sort of defend culture. And that's like after the election of Trump.
You mean to defend it as such, apart from the partisanship?
Yes, yeah, defend culture as such. But the problem is that even making that move is perceived to be
that's conservative. Yeah,
conservative, and
at this point, I'm willing to say that I'm just a conservative. Like I was talking with my teaching assistants coming in for my undergrad art history survey course that we'll be teaching in the spring, and you know, 2 foreign students, you know, 2 international students, one Omer is my TA, one Indian American student, and one from Nigeria, one from Iran. Fresh off the boat, both, right? Graduate students who did their undergrad there rather than here. And, you know, it was easier for me to just explain we're just doing canonical art history. And, you know, like I'm notorious for doing old-fashioned stuff and dead white men and whatever. And we're just doing that.
Right.
And they were like, interesting. But, you know, I know from their CVs or whatever, you know, from their application materials, they're fine, you know.
Right.
And so, but I did feel...
Well, I spent some time with Omer, and I know he's fine just from... Omer's a great guy. I enjoyed hanging out with him at the RNC and the DNC. So, yeah.
Oh, no, he totally is. And, I mean, there is, at the Art Institute, there is this struggle, you know, where the institution's very social justice and very lefty, but the students do want to be artists, too. Right. And so there's the students have to struggle with that, because it's kind of like they're not sure whether they have to be successful career-wise, whether they have to talk the talk. and then also maybe believe the social justice mission, but that's in tension with the fact that they want to be artists.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And, you know, can they talk about their work apart from the identity categories that they're slotted into? Can they justify their work as something other than a cultural expression of their group, their community? Right. But they do struggle with it. And, you know, I think that especially the established genres like painting, you know, that there is a desire to just be a painter. You know, what's my work about? Painting. You know? So it's a funny situation that we're in, that makes it difficult because, again, how do you separate form from a cultural signifier, from a kind of, I don't know, ethnographic, anthropological artifact?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so, you know, Omer does abstract painting, but is that because Islamic culture forbids graven images? No, it's not. It's because he's into modernism, right? But, you know, I can just imagine one of my colleagues being like, oh, you know, this reminds me of the mosaic on the Alhambra Mosque, you know, or something, like just some ham-fisted, you know? And it's like, no, it's from Clement Greenberg. Right?
Right.
So, you know, it's part of post-abstract expressionist painting.
Yeah, but I mean, in this moment, on Twitter, there is a kind of a movement against the social justice approach to art from people like Justine Bateman. You know who Justine Bateman?
I don't know who that is. No.
She was an actress on Family Ties.
Oh yeah, I do know. Yeah, okay.
Justine Bateman. She's like saying like she kind of got big on Twitter right after Trump was elected by. She would take these videos that people would put up saying things like, I can't believe America is so horrible and that people hate women so much. And I'm going to shave my head and stop having sex with men and blah, blah, blah. And she would take all these different videos and she would evaluate them formally. Like, the lighting isn't very good here, and the pacing could have been slowed down to communicate more easily to the audience. But I do like the choice of wardrobe, and the editing is good. You know, she like, evaluate each of these videos as works of video art, and it was killer, and people liked it, and it made her kind of big on Twitter for a little while. But now she's talking about like how the last 15 years have been a wasteland for film, and AI is just another step in that direction.
Yeah.
And the need to encourage independent and individual voices in the medium, and so on and so forth. And she's kind of perceived to be Trumpy, you know, which is odd, right? And I think because Trump rose out of the crassness of commercial television culture, which was flattening everything.
So, totally inartistic.
He's an okay comedian.
No, that's true. But I'm just thinking of like his. I mean, I guess some of his buildings are.
I don't know.
But he didn't design them, of course.
Right.
I guess he had to approve the designs.
Yeah. I haven't thought about his work, the work of the architects around Trump.
I just know the apocryphal golden toilet in Trump Tower, and that just kind of tells you everything you need to know. Meaning, this is not like an art guy, really.
Right.
And of course, The Apprentice reality TV is also. I mean, I guess it's an art form.
I've not watched much of it. So if that is like,
TV, you know,
Jerry Springer, I guess, was an art form too. I don't know.
I mean, and he came out of the realm of politics. Didn't he go from politics to reality TV as opposed to going from reality TV to politics? Yeah,
he was in that, you know, that Phil Donahue, Oprah Winfrey genre of talk show. Yeah, but in any case, I would like it to be possible to get people to understand that if you're on the left, being committed to the formal development of art is actually in line with your left politics rather than some deviation away from what you ought to be doing. And I feel like it gets reflected in a variety of ways. Like in our recent conversation in the Parrot Room, there's this, it gets expressed as a desire to be materially relevant or practical, to do something immediately to get away from the discourse. Am I seeing a connection there that isn't there, or what do you make of that?
I mean, it is the question. I think that my whole life I've been dogged by this issue of activist art. And I really didn't want to do activist art. I mean, I did and I didn't, meaning my first publicly exhibited video work, which I've, to my everlasting chagrin, I've lost because it wasn't digitized. And so the video is just gone because it was on tape, you know.
And you lost the tape?
No, the tape disintegrated.
Oh.
When I was going to digitize it, yeah. And you know, because it was during the Gulf War, and it was political. It was a music video that used, you know, footage from the war and footage from, like, you know, politics. And, you know, it was very tightly edited montage type video. And, you know, in that way, very aesthetic, but also very cutting, biting commentary on the war and on the political sphere that I saw the war coming out of. And so, you know, again, I didn't think of it as an activist work. It was broadcast on PBS.
Well, then someone has to have it somewhere.
That's
right?
what you'd think. I actually investigated. Yeah, so it was done through. Did you ever hear of Deep Dish and Paper
maybe.
Tiger?
Oh, Paper Tiger, yeah.
Right, but Deep Dish Network. So there was, you know, coming out of the 70s, really, there were these collectives. There was these film and video collectives. And anyway, they compiled a reel of shorts that then they broadcast. And I was included. You know, so, you know, and I was very happy with it. But yeah, I've lost my own copy of it. So it might exist somewhere out there, but I did try to hunt it down many years ago now, like probably 20 years ago. I tried to hunt it down because, you know, it's from 1991. And
it already had disintegrated?
Yeah. Well, like 20 years ago. Yeah, because it was like a very early video art piece of mine. And so there was a 3/4 inch tape version and there was a 1/2 inch tape version, and the 3/4 inch tape version is more unstable actually than VHS. So 3/4 inch is what they used to use in like TV studios, right? But it's better, but it's more fragile.
It's better in the short term, but it's not a good way to preserve.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Paper Tiger. I forget there was a piece by the artist who did. A feminist artist who looked through, gave a narration while she looked through an edition of Cosmo magazine, or Vogue. I think it was Vogue. Actually,
that's not Joan Braderman, is it?
It might be. She also did. I think it was the same artist that did a piece in the 70s where she was in a kitchen, going through the alphabet and taking out implements.
I wonder if this is Joan. This is my professor from Hampshire.
Oh yeah,
yeah. I had two feminist video artist professors, Joan Braderman and Sherry Milner.
Yeah. Well, the thing about that,
like their thing.
Yeah, the things like I'm going to look up Braderman because, you know, have you gone to Ubu Web? Have you Do you know Ubu Web, which is a film? Yeah, okay. So she might be on. It might be on there. But anyway, yeah. The thing about that kind of political avant-garde video work from the 70s and 80s is that I really like it.
Yeah.
And I like it maybe aesthetically as well as politically, and I feel like it's thoughtful or just maybe some of it is less thoughtful than I thought when I first encountered it, but but it seems like that just led into a very reduced and kind of crippled form of art. And I'm not exactly sure why, except maybe for the same reason that anything that was on the left that was really being produced by the left just spiraled into a
I mean, I felt like I was participating in a dying genre when I was working as a video artist, because I do think that it was lumped in too much in terms of like film festivals with like basically alternative cinema. So with narrative work, with like low budget narrative work. And I just thought this is actually something else. And, so, and that was like my ideal setting for exhibition, only because it wasn't like installation work the way museum video art tends to be, or gallery video art tends to be. It's definitely single channel. It's about time, beginning, middle, end. It's not about like a loop.
Right.
So, in other words, you are meant to sort of watch it from beginning to end. Like in a theater, essentially, or on a television. And so, yeah, I do feel like that. I mean, probably it still is practiced, but I do think it got eclipsed in some ways. And it has to do with what we were talking about at the outset about like the internet and hypertext and that kind of thing. Like I do feel like things have become very literal, literal, prosaic, linear, and so no, it is sort of amazing. Like I feel like, like the YouTubers who have done things, it's all been like trick photography or something. It's never been like really playing with the form.
Well, it's hard to say what the YouTubers are doing because there's so much on YouTube, and what you get to see is determined by the algorithm.
Right.
And if you know, so there may be
the
like
people who made it big on YouTube, who became like YouTube celebrities through their videos and as videos.
Oh yeah.
Do it was, like very well produced things.
Yeah.
But I felt like it was like narrative or gimmicky or something. It wasn't like formal.
Yeah, well, like Mr. Beast is an example. There's a certain kind of high quality production for YouTube that gets to be very big, but it has a sensibility of television, and not even like real people, or believe it or not, rather than more thoughtful television. But
so even though we were talking about narrative the whole time, I feel like actually the triumph of narrative is a kind of an unfortunate thing, to my mind, because I do think that, like you can work in narrative genres and play with narrative.
Right.
But then to assume narrative in other genres, in other like not necessarily narrative media, does something. It sort of, it sort of reduces things to narrative, and then even changes what narrative is to its detriment.
Yeah.
I think
I may be guilty of finding narratives everywhere, but I think I know what you mean. Certainly the real problem is not just reducing everything to a narrative, but reducing everything to narratives that you already know.
Right, that's what I mean.
It's not that the problem is the reduction of everything to a story, but rather the reduction of everything to a story that you can understand from the first line
where it's going.
Yeah.
Where it's going. Yeah. And the political world hasn't helped, and the fact that everything is a narrative in the political world and that everything is a narrative that you can get out of any little bite of it. Like, you know,
Right.
you see a factoid and then you instantly know what narrative it fits into.
Yeah, that's very that's really troubling, actually. I
Very
think.
troubling, because it means that ideology is just fully naturalized.
Right. Yeah. Did you ever? I'm going to ask you one more question, and we should probably wrap it up for this side. But maybe that will be the last line. But have you ever heard of Gretchen Bender? Do you know her work?
I don't think so.
She was a video artist. I encountered her at the Museum of Modern Art 2 years ago. I'd never heard of her before either.
Mm-hmm.
She died in 2004. Yeah, I don't know. You might check her out. She did this thing that's kind of proto YouTube, but in a way that worked better in the museum space, where she would take like logos from network television or images from commercials, but then she would run them on loops on multiple screens with music behind it, and it would sort of have this. It had this cosmological kind of quality to it when you watch it in that setting. And I guess that to set up the last question here is: do you think that in a way what we're dealing with now is a premature return, or maybe it's any return would be premature, a return to ritualistic forms of art, a more kind of religious forms of art that are pre-bourgeois,
There does seem to be some evidence of that, right? I mean, in many respects, kitsch already has that quality. That it's a kind of retreat, and that even art itself becomes a ritual of itself. You know, so that even if it's not tied to a extra artistic ritual, it becomes its own ritual. You know, and in that way, that's how it lines up with entertainment. You know, meaning entertainment, what we were talking about earlier, like light genres, aren't asking much of you. You know, that might play with the genre expectations a little bit, but are not really going to make you question the genre.
Right.
You know, per se. And, you know, I mean, I think that I was, for some reason, flashing on, you know, really antiquated earlier terms that you were certainly familiar with, like news, infotainment. You remember infotainment?
Yeah.
And you know, because you guys were talking about the pseudo-event as an alternative to the spectacle.
Right.
Because the pseudo-event is a more precise idea, meaning that the media generates its own event.
Right.
Right. And of course, we're familiar now with the wall-to-wall coverage and how the media has to come up with things that keep you glued to the screen. Right. And, you know, and how politics might have been warped by that.
Yeah.
Now, again, I would say I'm not sure how new all that is, meaning that might be something that came already in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Right.
And that we've just changed the technology of the dissemination of it, and maybe we've accelerated the pace of that dissemination. Although, you know, I always like to remind people that anything that happened in the world could be in the morning newspaper the next day, as soon as you had the telegraph.
Right.
People were aware of things that happened at least only as far away as yesterday. But also morning edition, evening edition. Anything that happened during the day could be in the evening edition.
Right.
It happened in the world, the entire globe.
Yeah, but right now it feels like if something happens a minute ago or 2 minutes ago, I could know about it. You know, on Twitter or somewhere like that. So
it's faster. It's faster, but I feel like the public digests things probably still on a daily rhythm.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Right? So if you didn't hear about it yet, you will have heard about it by tomorrow. And if you haven't heard about it by tomorrow, then you're living under a rock.
Right, which is not necessarily a bad thing to do.
It's not a bad thing to do. I'd love to be free of this stream of, you know, of cascade of events. But I do think that, you know, the media generating itself, turning things into something. Now, I will make one intervention on that conversation that you guys had. Why should we care about the murder of the United Healthcare CEO? Because it was a terrorist act. It's not a murder.
Right.
It's not a murder. It's not anybody getting killed. It was a terrorist act. It was meant to be noticed.
Oh, right. That's what I meant, I think, when I said it was a pseudo-event.
It's a pseudo-event in the way the media handles it. And maybe Luigi Mangione is a victim of the prevalence of pseudo-events. But then that's true of the anarchists in the late 19th century, too. Already.
Right. Well, what I was saying is, like, we don't actually know that the man who was arrested was the killer. We don't know that yet. That we shouldn't rush to that conclusion, I don't think. Maybe it's true, but I would hold off on that.
Well, he was the killer. The question is whether they actually tampered with the evidence that they found, because that's what his lawyer is claiming.
Okay,
and
yeah.
Also,
but he admits to shooting the gun? He admits to pulling the trigger? I think I don't
think he said that to the police, no. But, I mean, it's kind of obvious. And he did yell while being taken away that, it's his lived experience.
No, what he yelled was, this is something along the lines of, this is a travesty. It is an insult to the intelligence of the American public. It goes against their lived experience, something like that.
Oh, it goes against their lived experience.
I don't think it was his own.
Making a claim for his own lived experience. Maybe you might be right. You might be right.
Which was just like in today's parlance was, I thought, him saying, "I'm a patsy."
Well, I mean, he might very well be. So what they found, his manifesto says to the feds, "I acted alone."
Yeah.
And to me, that seems very odd.
Yeah. No, it seems fake. Dear Feds, Dear Feds, it starts out.
You don't need to look.
I respect what you do so much, and I'm such an admirer of you.
No, but that might be. I could actually imagine that psychologically, him saying that. But it is convenient in the sense of there's no story here beyond this. Whereas maybe the CEO was taken out for reasons of, like, because wasn't he supposed to? He was scheduled to testify to Congress or something.
He was going to testify on insider trading allegations.
Yeah, so it could be that he would have implicated people who then might have wanted him dead rather than testify. Right.
All I'm going to say is that all of it from start to finish has been designed to be picked up by the media. The way it was staged with the surveillance camera was meant to be seen. It was not a mistake. And that...
you mean they did it in front of the surveillance camera?
That whoever shot that guy knew where the surveillance camera was and shot this guy on camera on purpose in the way that he did on purpose. There
are so many cameras now, Doug. So we were at the local grocery store and we were shocked to find they had just done some renovation that over the cash register area, which is also the exit area, that there are literally 20 cameras, like 20 of those globes with the cameras.
Oh.
Like, in other words, it's full coverage, meaning they can see everything from every angle. And you realize this is the reason.
Oh, right.
Right. In other words, that might not be the only surveillance footage. That might not have only been the only camera.
Well, maybe not. But my thought was,
might not have been. I don't know.
This guy knew that he was going to be on film when he shot the gun, and he did the killing in a way that would have a certain kind of effect. And so I'm with Walter Kern on this. I think that this is a staged event in some way. Whether or not staged by the guy they have in custody or someone else, I don't know.
You know that Steve Bannon said
that
this is a rich kid who killed a CEO who had worked himself up from the working class.
Well, that's just a fact.
That's a fact. But then he also said that Donald Trump is looking into the Singapore and French healthcare systems as models for changing American healthcare, both of which are, of course, socialized medicine.
Right.
In their own way. I mean, Singapore, it's some weird privatized, socialized,
kind of what we have now, right? I mean,
kind of what we have now. That was another thing that you guys failed to mention which is we already have socialized healthcare, and part of the huge costs is that. In other words, it's redistributed.
Yeah, but I was not wanting to talk about healthcare in that episode. I was trying to
because
focus.
that's the thing, right? So, but I think that for us, me and you, Chris Cutrone, last Marxist, Lenin.
Yeah.
What I want to say is terrorism.
Right.
Is not the way.
I agree with you.
Terrorism is not the way. And whether or not it was an act of terrorism, in reality, it is certainly being taken up by the left positively as an act of terrorism.
Yeah.
Affirmed.
Yeah. Right. And I want to say is, the would-be Philip K. Dick, 21st century version, you don't know what's real. You need to be skeptical. You need to stand back and be critical of what you're being presented.
No, all of that is potentially true. I mean, in other words, I'm not discounting that it's staged by the state.
Mm-hmm.
Unclear what the, apart from the obvious, unclear what the goal of that would be. Meaning obviously means that they can increase the security apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
But apart from that, why this in particular? Is it to, I don't know, put a final nail in the coffin of Bernieism?
It does undermine the left. It does undermine the left to have them embrace.
Well, you've heard that he's also been taken up as a folk hero by the right.
No, I didn't know that.
To a certain extent. Yeah. So, and also, I think the left, Jacobin at least, has disclaimed that Mangione is a leftist.
Right.
Right. So it's a kind of left-right populism thing.
Right. I think it's like they didn't. I think it's like, well, we didn't get to kill Trump, but we're going to have this symbolic murder go out into the world to kind of give ourselves a cathartic moment. And whether it's left or right, I guess both of those ideologies are in the Democratic Party anyway. The things that they would say is not leftist are certainly in the Democratic Party. I don't know. That's going too far. I don't actually want to say why these pseudo-events are being done. I just think that they have that character of there being
well, certainly something becomes a pseudo-event by virtue of its mediatization.
Right.
And, but I think also you can't say, okay, the media is just ginning this up. Meaning it's a spectacular event. It's a CEO of, isn't that the largest health insurer?
I think it may be. It's certainly the one that turns down the most claims. I know that.
But it also might be the single largest health insurer. And it's in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just too, hard to ignore as a media spectacle.
Yeah. Well, all I'll say is that I don't think that it is misguided to do some media analysis and be critical of the kind of stories that we've been given. It is not a good idea, which I am, in my privacy of my own mind, and sometimes it slips through, likely to do, to jump to some conspiracy answer, like, oh, the state definitely, MK Ultra, or somebody set this kid up, or maybe it was Nancy Pelosi in a hoodie, or something like all those things.
Right.
Put aside.
No, I mean, right. It's it's what it is that even something that isn't so intentional can be turned into something intentional, and then the question is, what's the intention? And I think that that's the pseudo-event character of it, is that what it's made to mean.
Right. And that has certainly been happening. Listen, let's stop it here, and then I'll go get my coffee, and we can do another session on a different topic. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.